The rain fell softly that morning, as if the sky itself were trying to wash away the tension that had been building for weeks. But there wasn't enough water in the world to cleanse the fear that had taken hold of Rwanda. Inside the modest, yet well-kept home of the Ilibagiza family, the muffled sound of the radio mixed with the soft tapping of rain on the banana leaves outside. Immaculée sat curled in the corner of the living room, her knees drawn up to her chest, eyes fixed on an invisible spot on the floor. She was 22, a college student, intelligent, beautiful, and full of deep faith. But that morning, none of her gifts seemed to matter. She was Tutsi, and that had become a death sentence. The news came through the radio. The president's plane had been shot down. Within minutes, the country descended into chaos. Outside, screams erupted like wildfire in dry brush, primal, guttural cries. "Kill all the Tutsis!" The war that had been whispered for months now roared through the windows. Immaculée's father, a man of unshakable faith and deep respect in the community, knew exactly what was coming. He told his children to run. "Go, hide, now," he urged, his voice trembling. Immaculée didn't know it then, but that would be the last time she would see his face. She ran, heart pounding, soul unraveling, and went straight to the home of a Hutu pastor, a longtime family friend, a man of faith, or at least that's what she believed. He greeted her with frightened eyes, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. She begged him, "Please, hide me, they're killing everyone." He hesitated, but something deep inside him wouldn't let him say no. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was mercy. Certainly, it was God. Inside the pastor's small house, he led her to a tiny bathroom hidden behind a wooden wardrobe. It was barely 5 feet long and 3 feet wide. No windows, no light. The air was thick. And there, beside 7 other women, Immaculée folded herself into that space as if willing her body to disappear. The bathroom was cramped, dark, suffocating. It wasn't meant to hold 8 living, breathing people, let alone preserve their sanity. The walls, stained with mold, seemed to close in more each day. The women pressed their bodies against the cold tiles, struggling to find space to breathe. The floor was bare concrete. A single crack beneath the door let in the smallest trace of air. There was no running water, no toilet, just a bucket, shared. In absolute silence. During the day, they couldn't move, couldn't cough, couldn't sneeze. The faintest sound could give them away, and being discovered meant certain death. The knocks on the front door came often. Militiamen, armed with machetes and spears, barged in without asking. They tore through closets, opened drawers. At times, they stood just inches from the hidden door, unaware of the bathroom behind the wardrobe. The pastor, heart caught in his throat, deflected them as best he could. Sometimes he claimed rats were making noises in the walls. Other times he said he was home alone with his family. The pastor's wife made no secret of her discomfort. She feared that hiding the women would endanger their own children, and she wasn't wrong. Even the children, too young to understand, wandered the house unaware that just behind one wall, 8 women were praying not to be found. Immaculée had no idea how long she'd be in that room. Hours? Days? Maybe weeks. But it turned out to be 91 days. 3 months in darkness. 3 months not knowing if the next sound would be the door creaking open, or death arriving. In that tiny prison, she began speaking to God like never before. Prayer, once a habit, became survival. At first, she prayed to be rescued, then to stay sane, and eventually to learn how to forgive. The human mind, when stripped of light, air, movement, and hope, begins to break. But in Immaculée, something unexpected took root. She began to have visions. She felt the presence of God fill that bathroom like the very air they lacked. One day, she heard the killers enter the house, screaming her name, tearing the place apart. They stopped just feet from the bathroom. One of them placed his hand on the doorknob. Her heart stopped, but he didn't open it. Later, the pastor would confess that something strange had passed through the house that day, a presence that had stopped the man from going any farther. Immaculate's faith grew like a root burrowing deep into dry, unforgiving earth. With each new threat, it grew stronger. She began praying constantly, dozens of times a day. She spoke to Jesus, to angels. This wasn't madness, it was spiritual survival. She began imagining the forest where she once walked, the green fields of her childhood, her brother's laughter, the scent of her mother's Sunday cooking. Those memories kept her alive, and at the same time, each one pierced her like a knife, because deep down, she knew she might never see them again. Time didn't exist inside that bathroom. The past was a haunting ache, and the future felt almost inappropriate to imagine. So distant, it seemed like a mirage. In the beginning, Immaculate's body fought against the darkness and the forced silence. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, everything began to change. Her body thinned visibly, her ribs jutted out. Her knees looked far too large for her fragile legs. Her hair fell out in handfuls, and the once radiant glow of her skin faded into dullness. There were no mirrors in that place, but she could feel the transformation in her very flesh, and still, her soul endured. The pain didn't come only from hunger, thirst, cold, or immobility. It came from absence, from death that hadn't been confirmed, but pulsed with every heartbeat. It was as if her family was crying out to her through the silence. She dreamed of her brothers, her father, her mother, sometimes smiling, sometimes running from killers, covered in blood. Immaculate would jolt from sleep in a panic, even though she never truly slept. Because in that cramped prison, sleep was only a fragile illusion. Living with the 7 other women was silent, but not peaceful. Some cried softly in the darkness. Others stared blankly into space. At times, the tension between them thickened like smoke, each one trying to claim just one more inch of space, each one battling demons of her own. The bathroom smelled of urine, of fear, of people trapped for far too long. The bucket they used for their needs was emptied only at night, when the house was quiet, and always with painstaking care. The smallest sound could betray them. One night, the militiamen came back. They were drunk. They wanted to search every room. One of them even tugged at the wardrobe that concealed the bathroom door. It groaned loudly. Inside, Immaculate and the others froze. No one dared to breathe. The sound stopped. The men shouted for more alcohol, laughed like madmen, smashed furniture, and then they left. That night, Immaculate's faith spilled over. In tears, she felt God was protecting her, not from afar, but directly, intimately, as though angels stood guard on the other side of that door. She began reciting prayers all day long, hundreds of times. The Lord's Prayer became her anchor. But there was one line she couldn't bring herself to say: "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." That line hurt too much. How could she forgive the killers who had slaughtered her mother? How could she forgive the neighbors who now marched with machetes, thirsty for blood? How could she forgive those who had destroyed everything she had ever loved? But she felt it deep within her. If she didn't learn to forgive, she would never leave that bathroom alive. Not alive in spirit, and maybe not alive in body either. Anger and fear were poisons, and they were eating her from the inside. Then, on one cold morning before dawn, something shifted. While praying, she felt a deep, peaceful stillness settle over her chest. It was like being wrapped in warmth, as though an invisible hand was resting gently over her heart. And for the first time she said the full line, "As we forgive those who trespass against us." And she wept. She wept everything she had held inside for weeks. It was as if her soul had finally been washed clean. From that day forward, her prayers were no longer for survival, they were for transformation. She began to study in her mind. She asked the pastor's family for books, a French Bible, a dictionary. Even in darkness, with no paper, no pen, she memorized new words, recited verses, mentally reconstructed texts. She made a promise. If she ever got out, she would master English. She would dedicate her life to peace. It was a silent vow, made at the altar of her pain. Outside, the genocide had reached apocalyptic proportions. Over 800,000 people had been killed. The country was soaked in blood and smoke. Bodies were dumped into mass graves. Rivers ran red. Orphaned children wandered the roads. Churches, once places of refuge, had become graveyards. Many had turned into slaughterhouses. Tutsis had gathered there in hope, only to be massacred where they prayed. The killers spared no one. Elderly, women, infants. There was no reason, no strategy, only hatred. Raw, senseless hatred, fed by years of propaganda, fear, and division. The pastor's family lived in constant tension. His children had started to suspect something. His wife grew increasingly restless. But the pastor, despite the fear, never broke his promise. He fed the women with whatever scraps he could find, sometimes just crumbs, sometimes a single boiled sweet potato. Immaculée thanked him as if it were a feast, because in that place, gratitude became a shield against despair. Then, one day, after nearly 3 months, the pastor came into the bathroom with a different look in his eyes. They were full of tears, but they also held something else, a glimmer. They say the Rwandan Patriotic Army is advancing, he said. The Hutus are retreating. This might be ending soon. Immaculée felt a flicker of hope spark in her chest. But it was a fragile flame. She had learned not to cling too tightly to hope because the fall could be unbearable. Still, that night, her prayer changed. She prayed with a lump in her throat, like someone who sees light at the end of a tunnel and fears it might be a mirage. A few days later, the pastor told her she had to leave, not because he was abandoning her, but because it was no longer safe to keep her there. He would help her reach a refugee camp held by the Tutsis. Immaculée felt the ground disappear beneath her. After 91 days, she would finally leave the bathroom. That night, before stepping out, she knelt on that filthy floor, took a deep breath, and with a soul washed clean, whispered, "Thank you, God. If I die now, I die with faith, but if I live, I will live for you." The bathroom door opened. For the first time in 3 months, fresh air touched her skin like a balm, and at the same time, like an assault. The world had changed. She had changed. Her weak body could barely hold her up. Her legs trembled like bamboo in the wind. But she was standing, empty of everything, except faith. The pastor led her through the darkness. They had to avoid the militias and the curious eyes of neighbors. They walked hidden paths, crossed abandoned backyards, and devastated fields. The night's silence was broken only by distant barking dogs or scattered gunshots. Immaculée walked slowly, her bare feet touching the earth with silent reverence. Each step was a prayer. Their destination was the house of a friend of the pastor, also Tutsi, also in hiding. There, Immaculée and other women would wait until they could be taken to a refugee camp controlled by the Rwandan Patriotic Front. When they arrived, the man opened the door in a rush, eyes wide, but as soon as he saw her, his face softened. "You survived?" he asked, as if looking at a miracle. She didn't answer. She just nodded, eyes filled with tears. At the refugee camp, reality was even harsher. It was like waking up from a nightmare, only to realize she was still inside it, just with a different setting. The ground was packed dirt, the tents made of torn fabric and branches. Children cried around empty barrels, mothers with hollow eyes tried to make sense of what was left. Immaculée walked among them like a shadow, silent, observant. Many recognized her. Some knew her family. Others looked away when they saw her. In a camp like that, death had names and faces. And she knew them. One of the first days, she approached a woman sitting with 2 small children by her side. The 3 of them were covered in dust. The woman looked at her and with silent tears said, "Your mother. She was one of the last to fall. She didn't scream, she prayed." Immaculée felt a blow to her chest. There was no more doubt. Her mother was dead, just like her father, just like her brothers. Her entire world had vanished. She walked to the edge of the camp where there was a solitary tree. She sat in its shade and cried until her body had no more water to give. She cried for her childhood, for her country, for her tested faith. But in the end, a deep silence took over her soul. And in that silence, she heard the voice that had followed her since the bathroom. Forgive. The days in the camp passed in mourning and survival. But Immaculée didn't surrender to despair. She started to help. She organized small prayer groups with other women. She comforted children. She wrote lists of the missing. It was as if her soul, after touching the bottom of the abyss, had found the light. That's when she learned her older brother was alive in another country. He had been studying in Europe and escaped the massacre. He was all that remained of her immediate family. She would reunite with him months later in a silent, deep, almost childlike embrace. They cried together. There were no words. Later, already safe, Immaculée discovered that the man who had led the massacre in her hometown was in prison, one of her mother's killers, one of those who had screamed her name in the streets. She could have ignored him, but she didn't want to. She felt something unfinished in her story. She went to the prison. The man was chained, hunched, eyes low. When he saw her, he turned pale. She stood in front of him. He expected hatred, spitting, insults, but what he heard was a whisper. "I forgive you." He collapsed, not from pain, but from what pain had failed to destroy. Immaculée Ilibagiza survived the genocide not just with her body, but with her spirit. She became one of the most powerful voices for reconciliation in Rwanda and around the world. She wrote books, gave talks, inspired people in dozens of countries. Her unshakable faith became a bridge between horror and hope. She didn't forget what happened. She didn't erase the suffering, but she turned all of it into light and made her voice a universal message. In the end, it wasn't the hiding place that saved her. It was forgiveness. It was God. It was the choice to not let hate win, because true survival is not just staying alive, but remaining human. And now, after everything you've heard, I want to ask you something. Have you ever gone through a pain so deep, so devastating, that forgiveness seemed impossible? Maybe it wasn't genocide, but it was betrayal, a loss, an abandonment, something that left scars no one else could see. The forgiveness that Immaculée chose doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't justify, but it sets you free. And you? Can you imagine what it would be like to forgive someone who destroyed everything you loved? Write in the comments. Tell me if you've ever experienced something like this. How did you deal with that pain? Were you able to forgive, or are you still trying? This space is yours. Your story matters, and remember, forgiveness is not a gift for the other. It's the key that unlocks your own soul. Thank you for listening.